Kwani 2 had this person that was rediscovering themselves after 10 years, after 24 years under Moi. You had a new presidency that came in on a huge sweep of many promises of sort of democracy and sort of changes that were going to be made. So everyone in the country was on a high, actually. There was a kind of expected change that was hanging in the air. And by the time you get to Kwani 3, which is our specific, I think, exploration of Sheng as a language, you're talking to people who are mostly urban, who grew up in the city, who've grown up talking to each other in a language that has not been given any space in formal settings and actually is bastardized by the academy. It's a population of people who express themselves very well in that language and recognize that, but that can't deal with it in a formal space. So Kwani 3 was very much an experimentation of that. And then with Kwani 4, I think we started to explore the notion of tribe and our ideas about ourselves as people from different tribes. So that was a bit more to the political end. And Kwani 5 was documentation of the post-election violence. Kwani 6 was actually based on a short story competition for writers specifically under 30. Kwani 7, we explored the idea of travel and return. So we really wanted to explore that idea of the African diaspora and where does it sit, how does it look like in Europe, how does it look like in America, how does it look like in the rest of African countries. I think Kwani has been a very major contributor to the idea that there are narratives about Africans that are not famine and war and the sort of typical Eurocentric view of what Africa is. So in that way, it's very much opened up that space for creative expression and exporting those kind of ideas to the world. I personally feel very strongly that a kind of narrative that has very deep roots, that has been sort of preached about Africa, has been quite one-sided, right? So there's war and famine and there are all these things, but then there are also Africans living in cities, loving each other, going out to clubs, creating things, going to their normal jobs, 9 to 5. So I feel very strongly that Kwani has brought out those kind of aspects. But I think also the importance has been, in terms of telling stories to the world, the idea also of creating a writing community here that believes very strongly in writing their own stories and telling their own stories from their own perspectives. We had a really interesting project several years ago called 24 Nairobi that paired up 8 writers with 8 photographers. And the idea behind that was, a lot of coffee table books that you see about Africa, like wildebeest migration, elephants, lions, wildlife, scenic landscape, and that does exist. But we really wanted to interrogate the idea of what is your own view as a resident of this city, of your space, right? So we put 8 writers and 8 photographers together, and the photographs were amazing. And it's just the kind of perspective. I think sometimes when you have people looking at a space from outside, there may be things that you carry that are either fetishizing the space, making it a little bit more exotic than people who actually live in it think it is. So that's a very huge motivating factor for us. I think in any kind of global economy, you're going to have difficulty because it's dealing, if you're coming from a place that's, socioeconomically, you're completely different, right? So the technicalities, say, of trying to get African writing, say, into Europe, will have its own distribution and other issues that are not creative, that are not a creative question per se, but just have to do with practicalities, right? I very much appreciate the idea, for instance, of the collaborations that we've had between Cassava Republic in Nigeria and Chimurenga in South Africa, because there is an editorial philosophy that is shared of that we can create something from the continent that does not have to refer to a place outside like Europe or America for it to exist as an idea that is valid. So that's very important for me personally, and I know for a lot of the people that we work with. I think there's always more to be done. I think these are small spaces that have grown based on an editorial philosophy and sensibility that's shared by a group of people, but that other spaces could come up, and because you can't do it alone. In fact, it would be such a measure of health for the creative sector if there were other spaces that could also challenge Kwani and Chimurenga and Cassava Republic and Farafina, and maybe also concentrate on other aspects that we may not be that good at. I think there's more to be done, certainly. I'm very excited by the idea of digital platforms and building content that can be absorbed into a multitude of platforms. So the whole idea of transmedia storytelling, with a small organization like Kwani, it really helps you to reach someone in, say, Spain, for example, much, much quicker than having to put a book in the post, and is much, much cheaper. So I think these boundaries are going to come down a lot more, and that you're going to find a bigger space for audiences as we go ahead. We're very much over 2014 experimenting with the idea of literature on mobile, for instance. It's our next project. We've got content that's 10 years old that carries a certain kind of sensibility that's one of the biggest depositories of contemporary content in Eastern Africa. So the idea that that could reach someone who could subscribe for €5 a month in Spain or in Greece or in, anywhere really, is one that Kwani is really just trying to strategize on. And I think that's certainly the next big thing. And with African audiences who are at least based on the continent, I think the mobile by far overtakes any other device that has been in use on the continent ever. So those are the directions that we're heading in.